The wheels of the private jet touched the tarmac with the slightest tremor, a smooth landing that echoed the discipline of Alexander Harrington's life. At 58, Alexander had built an empire out of steel, finance, and relentless ambition. He was a billionaire whose signature adorned contracts that spanned continents, whose presence in boardrooms made younger men quake. Yet, as he leaned back in his leather seat and stared out at the early evening sky, streaked with shades of molten gold, there was no sense of triumph in his eyes. There hadn't been for years, not since Eleanor's death. 3 years had passed since cancer had stolen her from him. 3 years since the halls of Harrington Manor had grown hollow and cold. Eleanor had been the warmth in every room, the music that played even when silence fell. She was the one who made the sprawling estate feel like home rather than a fortress. Without her, Alexander had immersed himself in work with a zeal that bordered on obsession. His executives assumed it was hunger for expansion, a drive to cement his legacy. In truth, it was escape. The farther he traveled, the longer he stayed in glass towers across the globe, the less he had to feel the emptiness waiting for him back in Connecticut. Yet something had shifted in him this week. He couldn't quite explain it. He had been in Zurich, finalizing the merger of a European shipping company. The deal was sound, the numbers strong, but during a dinner with investors, Alexander had looked at the crystal goblets and linen-draped tables and felt a sudden, overwhelming fatigue. The laughter around him had rung hollow. The thought of returning to yet another anonymous hotel suite filled him with dread. For the first time in years, he wanted to go home. Not next week, not tomorrow, but now. His assistant had protested. His presence was expected in London for a meeting with parliamentarians about a new tax regulation. His legal team urged him to stay to celebrate the deal. But Alexander's mind was made up. He left the champagne to bubble untouched in the flutes and booked the jet that very night. His staff assumed he was chasing yet another opportunity. Only he knew he was running toward something instead of away. By the time the black Bentley carried him up the long driveway of Harrington Manor, dusk had settled in, painting the estate in shades of lavender and shadow. The house loomed ahead, its Georgian facade severe yet beautiful, lit softly by sconces along the gravel path. It was as majestic as any palace. Yet Alexander couldn't shake the image of Eleanor standing at those steps years ago, waiting for him after a long trip, her smile brighter than any light. That image pierced him. There would be no warm embrace now, no teasing remark about the weight of his briefcase or the scold of neglecting his health. Only the silence. The staff had been informed of his arrival, though not with much notice. The butler, Mason, greeted him at the door, stoic and efficient as always. "Welcome home, sir," Mason intoned, bowing slightly. Behind him, 2 maids hurried to collect Alexander's coat and briefcase. Their presence was familiar, yet distant. Alexander nodded absently, acknowledging them without warmth. Since Eleanor's passing, the relationship between master and staff had reverted to formality. The camaraderie Eleanor fostered had evaporated, replaced with invisible walls Alexander himself had erected. "I'll dine later," Alexander murmured, brushing past Mason. His voice was heavy, as though the journey had drained more than miles from him. No interruptions. He ascended the marble staircase slowly, his hand grazing the polished banister. Each step brought memories. Eleanor gliding down in gowns for charity galas, laughter drifting from the halls when guests filled the rooms. Now his footsteps echoed alone. He reached the landing and paused, a strange sound tickling his ear. It was faint at first, carried like a whisper through the corridor. Music! A piano! His brow furrowed. The grand Steinway in the music room had been silent since Eleanor's death. She had been the only one who played it, her fingers coaxing magic from ivory keys. Alexander had forbidden anyone to touch it afterward. The music room had become a shrine, locked more often than not, its silence a monument to his grief. And yet here was the sound, soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. A melody drifting through the air, fragile as glass. His chest tightened. He quickened his pace, following the notes down the corridor. Each measure grew clearer, tugging at memories he thought buried. It was a piece Eleanor used to play in the evenings when they were alone, a nocturne filled with melancholy beauty. He reached the tall, double doors of the music room. They stood slightly ajar, the light from within spilling across the polished floor. He pushed them open soundlessly and stepped inside. What he saw stopped him cold. Grace was seated at the piano. Grace, the quiet maid who had been in his service for more than a decade, whose presence he had barely registered beyond the efficient upkeep of his home. A woman in her mid-40s, tall and steady, her dark skin glowing faintly in the lamplight, her hair pulled back in a simple bun. She had always moved with the discretion of someone who understood invisibility was part of her job. Yet now she sat at Eleanor's piano, her hands trembling slightly as they pressed the keys, her eyes closed as though she were lost in another world. Alexander stood rooted to the spot, unable to breathe. The audacity of it struck him first, Grace, touching what had been sacred. But then came the shock of the music itself. She was not fumbling clumsily as one might expect of an amateur. Her playing carried emotion, restraint, and a strange intimacy, as though she knew the piece not merely as notes, but as a story etched into her bones. He wanted to speak, to demand an explanation, but his throat was tight. He could only watch as Grace finished the passage, her fingers lingering over the final chord, letting it resonate in the silence. When the sound faded, she remained still, shoulders slightly hunched, as though the act had cost her something. The billionaire who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, who commanded rooms with a single glance, suddenly felt powerless in his own house. Why was Grace playing Eleanor's song? And how did she know it so well? Alexander didn't confront Grace that night. He remained in the doorway, long enough to watch her close the lid of the Steinway with a reverence that startled him, as though she were sealing away a secret. She rose from the bench and smoothed her uniform, unaware that he stood just beyond the shadows. Then quietly she exited through the side door, her footsteps fading into the hush of the manor. Alexander stayed in the empty room, staring at the piano. The silence that followed her departure was heavier than the melody itself, and in it came a flood of memories he had long tried to bury. Eleanor had always played in the evenings. It was her way of stitching peace into their home after a day of corporate battles and social obligations. She would sit at the Steinway with a glass of red wine balanced on the edge, her hair spilling over her shoulders, her fingers dancing across the keys. She never performed for anyone but him, never sought applause. The music was hers alone, a private language between husband and wife. Alexander would stand near the window with a scotch in hand, pretending to read the Wall Street Journal, but in truth, he was listening, always listening. That was the woman he had lost. Warm, graceful, impossible to forget. Her death had left him stripped of color. The mansion became a mausoleum. He had banished music from its halls because the sound was unbearable without her. Yet now Grace had revived it, and not just any piece, but one of Eleanor's favorites, played with uncanny familiarity. The question tormented him through the night. How could Grace, the maid who had never been more than a shadow in a household, know a melody so deeply woven into his marriage? Sleep eluded him. He lay in the vast bed alone, staring at the carved ceiling, while thoughts unraveled. For the first time in years, he let himself wander back to those days when Eleanor lived. He remembered her laughter spilling through the breakfast nook, the way she teased him for reading stock reports over coffee. He remembered the garden parties where she floated like a queen among guests, drawing admiration with her kindness more than her wealth. He remembered her final months, too, fragile, pale, yet still smiling as if she could bear the weight of his sorrow alongside her own. Through those recollections, Grace's presence was faint but steady. She had been there in the background, moving quietly with trays of tea, adjusting curtains, keeping the house immaculate even when grief had unmoored everyone else. He realized he could recall her standing by the doorway when the hospice nurses came, her eyes lowered yet attentive. She had driven Eleanor to some of her appointments when Alexander was tied up with meetings. At the time, he had barely noticed, his mind consumed by fear of losing Eleanor. Grace had simply been part of the machinery of the household, reliable and silent. But now, in hindsight, he saw the threads. He remembered walking past the sitting room once, months before Eleanor passed, and catching a glimpse of Eleanor and Grace talking softly. Eleanor had been smiling, her hand resting lightly on Grace's arm, a gesture of intimacy unusual between employer and servant. He had dismissed it as Eleanor's natural warmth, the same kindness she extended to gardeners, chauffeurs, and wait staff. Yet perhaps there had been more. The next morning, Alexander moved through the house with sharper eyes. At breakfast, he sat at the long mahogany table and watched Grace enter with a tray of fresh coffee and fruit. Her movements were precise, her expression unreadable. When their eyes met briefly, she dipped her head and retreated without a word. He studied her in a way he never had before. There was strength in her bearing, a quiet dignity that made invisibility almost seem like a choice. He wondered how long she had carried this composure, how much of herself she had hidden in silence. As days passed, Alexander found himself observing her more often. He noticed how she lingered in certain rooms, particularly Eleanor's old study, dusting with unusual care as though the objects there carried meaning beyond their material worth. He noticed how she tended to the rose garden Eleanor had adored, pruning with a delicacy that betrayed affection rather than duty. These were small details he would have ignored before, but now they struck him as pieces of a larger puzzle. One evening, while wandering the manor's library, Alexander discovered something that unsettled him further. On a lower shelf, tucked among neglected volumes, he found a thin music book. He pulled it out and opened it. Inside were notations in Eleanor's handwriting, slight corrections to a nocturne, reminders of dynamics, and in the margins, in a different hand, were other notes. More practiced, more disciplined, like the markings of a teacher. Alexander frowned. He had assumed Eleanor was self-taught in piano, her playing an indulgent hobby. But these annotations suggested she had been guided. Had Grace been her teacher? The idea seemed absurd. Yet, the handwriting was not his wife's, and no one else in the household could have made those marks. The discovery gnawed at him. He recalled Eleanor once laughing, saying she wished she had more discipline in her practice. He had teased her for being too hard on herself. But what if she hadn't been joking? What if someone had been helping her all along? The more he thought about it, the more Eleanor's secrecy began to trouble him. Their marriage had been built on openness, or so he believed. Yet, what if there were corners of her life he had never entered? What if Grace had shared moments with her that he, her husband, never knew existed? The possibility left him restless. He began to notice how often Grace seemed to disappear into her own world, slipping into rooms when she thought no one was watching, her face softened with something like memory. He wondered if she carried Eleanor's secrets with her, if behind her silence was an entire story untold. One afternoon, while passing by the sunroom, Alexander paused when he heard a faint hum. He peered through the glass and saw Grace watering Eleanor's orchids, her lips moving with a tune. It was another melody Eleanor used to play. The realization struck him like a blow. These weren't coincidences. Grace knew Eleanor's music intimately, in a way that defied her role as merely the maid. The seeds of suspicion and curiosity tangled together in Alexander's mind. He began to feel as though he were the outsider in his own home, excluded from something that had existed right under his nose. He wondered what conversations had passed between Eleanor and Grace when he wasn't there, what confidences had been exchanged. He wondered if Eleanor had entrusted Grace with parts of herself she had withheld from him. The thought was unbearable, yet impossible to dismiss. As night fell again, and he sat alone in his study, Alexander poured himself a scotch and stared into the amber liquid. He felt anger simmering not at Grace, but at the silence of years, the blindness he had chosen. He had lived in a fortress of wealth and power, Yet perhaps he had known his wife less than the woman who scrubbed his floors. For the first time in his life, Alexander Harrington feared the truth, not because it threatened his empire, but because it threatened the one thing he had left, his memory of Eleanor. And if that memory was incomplete, if it was shadowed by secrets, then what did he really have? For several days, Alexander carried the weight of questions that refused to let him rest. He told himself it was foolish to pry, that a maid's quiet fondness for music meant nothing more than nostalgia, but he knew better. Grace's fingers on the keys, her hums in the sunroom, the notations in Eleanor's music book, all pointed toward something deeper. The silence between them now felt oppressive. Every time she appeared to set the table or pour his drink, Alexander felt as though there were a wall of glass between them, one she had chosen to build, and he had chosen not to break. But that could not continue. The confrontation happened one evening in the music room, as though fate had drawn them both back to the place where his suspicions had first ignited. Alexander had poured himself a drink and stood near the window, staring out at the dying light. He heard the door creak behind him, and when he turned, there was Grace with a cloth and polish, clearly intending to dust the Steinway. She froze when she saw him, her hand still on the doorframe. "You can come in," Alexander said, his voice lower than he intended. "I imagine you were heading here. Anyway." Grace hesitated, then stepped inside. Her eyes flicked to the piano but didn't linger. She set the cloth on the bench, her composure unshaken. Though Alexander thought, he caught a flicker of unease. "I'd like to ask you something," he began. His tone was measured, almost formal, as though they were in a boardroom instead of a house that had become a mausoleum. "The other night, I came home earlier than expected. I saw you in here, playing." Grace's shoulders stiffened, but she said nothing. "You were playing a piece Eleanor loved," Alexander continued, his voice tightening. "Not only playing it, you played it well. Too well for someone merely dabbling. I need to know, Grace, how do you know that music?" For a long moment, Grace was silent. Her dark eyes were steady, but her lips pressed into a thin line. "Forgive me, sir," she finally said, her voice low. "I should not have touched the piano. It was not my place." "That's not an answer," Alexander said sharply, surprising himself with the edge in his tone. "How do you know Eleanor's music?" Grace dropped her gaze. She clasped her hands together, the polished cloth crumpled between her fingers. "Mrs. Harrington, she asked me to play with her sometimes," she admitted quietly. "In the afternoons when you were away. She said it helped her practice. I taught her a little." Alexander stared at her, stunned. The words crashed into him like a storm. He had imagined hints, suspected fragments of truth, but hearing it aloud left him reeling. "You taught her," he repeated. "Yes, sir." Grace's voice grew firmer now, though tinged with reluctance. "Before I came here, I studied music. My mother was a pianist in the church. I learned from her and from lessons I could barely afford. Life, it took me down a different road, but the piano never left me. Mrs. Harrington discovered it by chance. I was dusting in here one morning when she asked if I could play. I tried to refuse, but she insisted. From then on, she would call me in, and we'd sit together at that bench." Alexander felt the room tilt. Images of Eleanor alone at the Steinway unraveled, replaced with the vision of her sitting shoulder to shoulder with Grace, laughing, learning, sharing music that he had always believed was his wife's private gift. His chest tightened with a strange cocktail of jealousy, grief, and disbelief. "Why didn't she tell me?" he demanded, his voice cracking with the effort to remain calm. "Why did she hide this from me?" Grace hesitated again, her face softening. "Because she wanted something of her own," she said gently. "Not in defiance of you, sir, but because she was more than just Mrs. Harrington, wife of a great man. She wanted to learn, to grow, to be seen for who she was. Music gave her that. She told me once that when you listened, you saw her beauty, but when we played, she felt her strength." The words pierced Alexander deeper than any accusation could have. He sank onto a nearby chair, the drink trembling in his hand. He thought of all the years he had believed he knew Eleanor completely, believed that their bond was unshakable. Yet here was proof that there were chambers of her heart he had never entered, corners she had chosen to share with someone else. "Why you?" he whispered, more to himself than to Grace. "Because I listened," Grace said, simply, "and because she trusted me." She said I reminded her of the girl she once was, eager, stubborn, alive with possibility. She wasn't hiding it to hurt you, sir. She was protecting you. She knew how heavy the world already sat on your shoulders. She didn't want to add to it. Alexander's mind reeled. He remembered Eleanor's smile when she emerged from the music room, how it carried a secret glow he had attributed to the joy of playing. He remembered her insistence that he rest in the evenings, that she would occupy herself. And he remembered his own blindness, how often he let his work swallow him whole while she found companionship not in him, but in Grace. A surge of bitterness rose within him. "So, all this time I was excluded," he said harshly. "My wife shared herself with you in ways she never did with me. Do you understand what that feels like?" Grace's expression didn't falter. "I do," she replied softly, "because I lost her too. You were her husband, her love, but she was my friend, perhaps the only true friend I have ever known." The simplicity of her words struck Alexander harder than any argument. Grace had not spoken with pride or arrogance, but with sorrow. It wasn't rivalry she carried in her voice, but grief. In that moment, Alexander saw her not as a maid, not as an interloper, but as another soul wounded by Eleanor's passing. Silence stretched between them, filled with ghosts. Alexander felt the air grow heavy in his lungs. He had wanted answers, but the truth was harder than he imagined. Eleanor had indeed been more than the figure he adored. She had been a woman with hidden depths, seeking companionship and growth in places he had overlooked. And Grace had been her confidant. "I thought I knew her," Alexander finally whispered, almost to himself. "I thought we shared everything." "You shared love," Grace said, her voice steady. "That is no small thing. But love does not mean knowing every corner of a person's soul. Sometimes the ones we love still keep parts of themselves hidden, not out of deception, but because those parts are fragile and they fear they won't be understood." The words unsettled him because they rang with truth. He realized then that he had spent much of his marriage as he spent his life, in control, certain, commanding. Eleanor had adored him. Yes, but perhaps she had also needed freedom from the shadow of his certainty. Perhaps Grace had given her that freedom in a way he never could. For the rest of that evening, Alexander could not speak. Grace bowed her head and excused herself, leaving him alone with the Steinway and the silence. He ran his hand across the piano's polished surface, feeling the faint vibrations of the melodies Eleanor had once coaxed from it. It no longer felt like a monument to grief, but like a vessel of secrets he had ignored. That night, lying awake in his bed, Alexander's heart churned with conflicting emotions. He felt betrayed, yet he also felt humbled. He was furious at Eleanor for keeping something from him, yet he loved her even more for the complexity of her spirit. He envied Grace, yet he pitied her too, for her bond with Eleanor had left her bereaved in silence, with no right to mourn publicly. For the first time in years, Alexander cried. Not just for Eleanor, but for himself, for the man who thought wealth and power could shield him from the mysteries of love, and for the woman who had lived beside him while keeping part of her heart hidden in the company of another. The truth had shattered him, but beneath the shards, something stirred, an awareness that he had more to learn, more to face. And perhaps, just perhaps, Grace was the only one who could help him understand the woman he thought he had known. The days that followed the revelation were among the most difficult Alexander Harrington had endured since Eleanor's death. He had thought grief was a fixed wound, sharp at first but dulled with time. Now, that wound had been torn open afresh, as if Eleanor had died only yesterday, and with it came a new kind of agony, doubt. Doubt about who she truly was, doubt about what their marriage had meant, doubt about the very foundation of the life he had built with her. He prowled the manor like a restless ghost, unable to concentrate on the reports Mason delivered from the office, uninterested in calls from his financial advisors. For the first time in decades, The empire he had constructed seemed irrelevant, a monument of steel and numbers that offered no solace. He found himself pacing the corridors at odd hours, his footsteps echoing against the marble, his thoughts circling the same painful questions. Why had Eleanor trusted Grace with something so intimate? Why had she concealed it from him? Had he failed her as a husband? Or had she simply needed a part of her life untouched by his shadow? The uncertainty gnawed at him more than any concrete betrayal could have. In business, betrayal was measurable. Contracts broken, shares sold, alliances turned. In love, betrayal was elusive, slippery, impossible to quantify. It wasn't that Eleanor had loved another, he had no reason to suspect that, but she had confided in someone else, found fulfillment in another's company. That, to Alexander, was enough to unravel the certainties he had once held. One afternoon, while brooding in the library, he called for Grace. She arrived promptly, her face calm as ever, though Alexander thought he saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She stood before him with her hands folded, waiting. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the armchair opposite his. The command surprised even him. He had never invited her to sit in his presence, not once in the years she had served. Grace hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair, her back straight, her eyes fixed on him with quiet respect. "I need to understand," Alexander began, his voice low, roughened by sleepless nights. "You say Eleanor trusted you. Tell me what that means. Tell me everything." Grace inhaled slowly, as if summoning the strength to unearth long-buried truths. "Mrs. Harrington was kind in ways most people of her station are not," she said. "She spoke to me, not at me. She noticed when I was tired, when my hands were raw from cleaning. She asked about my family, though I had little to tell. Over time, she stopped seeing me as just a maid. She treated me as—" Grace paused, her throat tightening. "As a person." Her words struck Alexander like a blow. He realized, with shame, that he could not recall ever asking Grace a single question about her life. She had existed in the periphery of his world, efficient, invisible, reliable. He had seen her hands polish silver, but never wondered what those hands had held before. "Where did you come from, Grace?" he asked suddenly. She blinked, startled by the question, then lowered her gaze. "Georgia, a small town with little to offer. My mother worked in a laundromat. My father left when I was young. We had little, but she gave me music. She played the piano at church every Sunday, and I learned by watching her. We couldn't afford lessons for long, but I practiced whenever I could. For a while, I thought it would carry me somewhere. But life has a way of closing doors. By the time I was 18, I was cleaning houses instead of playing music halls. When I came here, I thought that dream was gone forever. Until your wife asked me to sit beside her at the Steinway." Her voice wavered slightly, though she kept her composure. "With her, I remembered who I had been, and she, in turn, found joy in learning. We gave each other something the world had denied us. She gave me dignity, and I gave her music." Alexander felt his throat constrict. Eleanor had done what he had not, looked beyond Grace's uniform and seen a human being with stories, with dreams. It shamed him, but it also deepened his grief. Eleanor had shared something sacred with Grace, and he had been excluded not out of malice, but because he had never thought to ask, never thought to see. "You speak of her as though she were your equal," Alexander said softly, more observation than accusation. "She treated me that way," Grace replied, "but I knew my place. That's why I never told you, sir. It wasn't my secret to share. I respected her too much for that." Alexander leaned back, exhaling heavily. His emotions churned: anger, sorrow, admiration, humiliation. He wanted to lash out, to accuse Grace of overstepping, but the truth was undeniable. Eleanor had trusted Grace because Grace had earned it not through wealth or power, but through empathy. Alexander, for all his billions, had failed to offer his wife the same. The room grew heavy with silence. Alexander stared at the fire crackling in the hearth, its flames reflecting his turmoil. For decades, he had lived with the certainty that money could solve anything, that control and discipline could keep life in order. Now, all of that seemed hollow. He could buy ships companies' entire skyscrapers, but he could not buy the intimacy his wife had shared with the woman who dusted his furniture. "Do you resent me?" he asked abruptly. Grace looked up, startled. "No, sir." "Why not? I ignored you. I never cared to know your name beyond your duties. My wife gave you friendship, and I gave you orders. Do you not resent me for that?" Her expression softened. "I chose this work. I knew what it meant. I never expected kindness from you. But Mrs. Harrington, she offered it freely. That was enough for me." Alexander felt tears sting his eyes, though he fought to contain them. He thought of Eleanor's laughter, her insistence on throwing open the grand halls for charity events, her desire to bring warmth into the cold marble walls of the manor. She had always tried to balance his severity with compassion. Perhaps this was her final act of defiance, to remind him, even in death, that the world was larger than his empire and the people in it richer than he imagined. The conversation ended quietly. Grace excused herself, leaving Alexander alone once more. But something had shifted within him. He no longer saw Grace as a servant. He saw her as a living repository of Eleanor's truth, the keeper of stories he had never heard, the witness to sides of his wife he had overlooked. That night, Alexander walked the halls differently. He lingered in Eleanor's study, running his hands over her books, her journals, the photographs that lined her desk. He saw the spaces she had inhabited not just as his wife, but as a woman with her own desires, her own secrets, her own friendships. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge that he had not known her fully, and perhaps no husband ever could. But he also understood something else. If he wanted to hold on to Eleanor, to honor her memory, truthfully, he needed Grace. He needed her memories, her perspective, her companionship. Without Grace, Eleanor's story would remain incomplete, a puzzle with missing pieces. As he stood in the music room later that night, the Steinway gleaming under the lamplight, Alexander whispered aloud, as though Eleanor might still be listening. "I thought I knew everything, but I didn't. Forgive me." The truth had shattered his certainties about love, about control, about wealth. But in those broken shards, he saw the faint outline of something new, humility. And with humility came the possibility of healing. The winter sun rose late over Harrington Manor, painting the frost-laced windows with a pale glow. Alexander Harrington, once a man who measured mornings by the tick of stock markets and the shuffle of financial briefings, now lingered in silence at the kitchen table. The world beyond the estate continued its endless churn of profits and losses, but inside these walls, time seemed to stretch differently. It had been weeks since his conversation with Grace, and the man who sat there was no longer the same one who had stormed with questions and grief. Something in him had broken, but in the breaking, something new had begun to take shape. Grace moved quietly about the kitchen, preparing tea as she often did, though the dynamic between them had changed. She no longer hovered at the edges, waiting to retreat at the slightest dismissal. Alexander had asked her to sit with him sometimes, and she had reluctantly agreed, though her posture still carried the wariness of someone unaccustomed to being treated as an equal. That morning, when she placed the steaming cup before him, he gestured to the chair opposite. "Please," he said softly. She hesitated, then sat. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence was not the brittle silence of master and servant, but the tentative quiet of two people still learning how to speak to each other. "I've been thinking," Alexander began, his voice unsteady, "about Eleanor, about everything you told me. I realize now how much I missed, how much I refused to see. But I want to know more. Not just about her. About you." Grace looked at him, startled, then lowered her eyes. "I don't know what there is to tell." "There's plenty," Alexander insisted. "You knew her in ways I didn't. You shared something with her that I can only glimpse through you. And if you're willing, I'd like to hear it." Grace studied him for a long moment, searching his face for sincerity. At last, she nodded. "There are things she left behind," she said carefully, "things you may not have seen. Would you like me to show you? Alexander's heart gave a heavy thud. Yes, he said. That afternoon, Grace led him to Eleanor's old study, the room Alexander had avoided for years because it felt too much like stepping into her absence. Dust had gathered along the shelves despite Grace's care, and the air carried the faint, faded scent of Eleanor's perfume. Grace knelt before the lower drawers of the oak desk, her hands steady. From the bottom, she drew a small wooden box, worn at the edges but polished from years of handling. She placed it on the desk and stepped back. She asked me to keep this for her, Grace said quietly. She told me if the time ever came when you were ready to see her truth, not just the parts you already knew, then I should give it to you. Alexander's hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of letters, tied with a ribbon, along with a thin leather-bound journal. He touched the journal first, as though afraid the pages might disintegrate. On the first leaf, in Eleanor's graceful handwriting, was a simple dedication for the man I love and for the friend who reminded me who I was. His throat tightened. He turned the pages slowly. The entries were not confessions of scandal, but reflections, musings about her lessons at the piano, her fears during the nights when illness gnawed at her, her gratitude for Grace's companionship. There were passages about him, too, filled with love, admiration, and sometimes frustration. She wrote of his brilliance, his strength, but also of the loneliness that sometimes seeped into her heart when he was away, buried in business. One entry read, Alexander is my anchor, but Grace has become my mirror. Between them, I see who I am. Perhaps he will never understand why I needed her, but I hope one day he will forgive me for not sharing it. It was not secrecy, but survival. Alexander closed the book, pressing it to his chest as though to absorb her words through his skin. He felt tears burning his eyes, but he did not resist them this time. Grace stood nearby, her face solemn, her hands clasped as though in prayer. Why didn't she give this to me herself? He asked hoarsely. Because she knew you weren't ready then, Grace replied. She wanted to protect you from pain, even if it meant carrying it herself. She trusted me to keep it safe until you could bear it. Alexander bowed his head. And you carried that burden all these years. Grace nodded. It was not a burden, sir. It was an honor. In the days that followed, Alexander read every letter, every journal entry, sometimes aloud to Grace, sometimes alone by the fire. He discovered Eleanor anew, not as the perfect wife enshrined in his memory, but as a complex, yearning woman who had struggled, dreamed, and found solace in unexpected places. The revelations no longer wounded him as they once might have. Instead, they humbled him. For the first time, he realized love was not possession, not even complete understanding. It was the willingness to honor a person in all their mystery. Gradually, anew, rhythm settled into the manor. The music room, once a shrine of silence, came alive again. At Alexander's request, Grace played the Steinway in the evenings, her hands coaxing forth the melodies Eleanor had loved. Sometimes Alexander joined her, fumbling at first with clumsy attempts to follow sheet music, but Grace guided him patiently. The sound of music once more filled the house, no longer a reminder of absence, but a living tribute to Eleanor's spirit. The household staff noticed the change, too. The air of cold formality that had lingered since Eleanor's death began to lift. Alexander spoke to them with more warmth, sometimes even with genuine curiosity about their lives. It was as though Grace had unlocked something in him, a humility he had never known, recognition of the humanity that existed beyond his empire. One evening, as Grace prepared to leave the music room, Alexander stopped her. I owe you more than I can say, he told her. You carried a part of my wife's soul that I never touched. You could have kept it from me forever, but you didn't. You gave her back to me, in a way I never expected. Grace's eyes shimmered, though she blinked the tears away. She loved you deeply, sir. Don't ever doubt that. What she shared with me didn't take anything from you. It only added to who she was. And now it belongs to both of us. For the first time, Alexander smiled, not the brittle smile of a man performing for the world, but the soft, unguarded smile Eleanor used to draw from him. Then let us share her memory together, he said. Spring arrived, and with it came renewal. The rose garden Eleanor had loved burst into bloom, tended faithfully by Grace, but now joined by Alexander's own hands. He had never gardened before. Yet he found comfort in pruning the stems, in kneeling in the soil, in laboring alongside Grace. It grounded him, reminded him of what truly mattered, not the towers he owned, but the roots he had neglected. Months later, when Alexander hosted a charity gala in Eleanor's honor, the manor was filled with life again. Guests marveled at the warmth that returned to the halls, the music drifting from the Steinway as Grace played softly in the background. Alexander stood near the window where he had so often brooded and felt a peace he had not known in years. He had lost Eleanor, but through Grace, he had found a truer understanding of her and of himself. That night, after the last guest had departed, Alexander lingered in the music room. Grace closed the piano gently, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, he addressed her not as a servant, not even as a teacher, but as something else entirely. "Thank you, Grace," he said simply. "For everything. For her. For me." She inclined her head, her voice soft but firm. "You're welcome, Alexander." In that moment, the widowed billionaire, once shattered by loss and blinded by certainty, felt whole again. Not because the truth had been easy, but because he had finally embraced it. Eleanor was gone, but her memory lived on, not in marble or money, but in the music, the letters, the friendship, and the quiet dignity of the woman she had left behind. And for the first time in years, Alexander Harrington no longer felt alone.